So here I want to use this short video to explain the end of the lecture we did tonight that we were sort of short of time to do in class. So we were talking about when we add debt to our capital structure, it makes the earnings per share more volatile. So by that we mean if the earnings EBIT is high, then the earnings per share after the introduction of debt becomes even higher. But when the EBIT is low, then the introduction of debt makes the EPS earnings per share to be even lower. So in that sense, debt makes equity holders to become riskier. So from this chart, it's rotating around a what we call a break-even point northwest. So and in terms of formula, that's this so-called Modigliani and Wiener population 2. It's expressed as this is the cost of equity um, and equals R0. R0 here is cost of equity when there's no debt in the firm's capital structure. So it's also called cost of unlevered equity or return on the unlevered equity plus B over S. So that's the debt over equity times parentheses R0 minus RB. RB here is the cost of debt, before tax cost of debt. So from this formula, in general, this RB is smaller than R0. So in general, so this term is positive. So that means if B over S increases, then RS increases. So RS is the cost of equity. So that suggests cost of equity will increase with the amount of debt in the firm's capital structure. So that's consistent with their observation we did using the example we did in class, such as the return on equity becomes more volatile when they introduce debt in the firm's capital structure. So now I want to work on this homemade leverage example, which is shown in my lecture slides here. So this is for this unlevered firm, but what we want to do here is to net the investors choose to become levered rather than the firm. So the idea for the homemade leverage is that if the investors can be levered and have the same leverage or same debt ratio as the firm, then the investors actually don't need the firm to take on debt on their behalf. By investors, here we mean the shareholders. So the shareholders don't need the firm to take on debt on their behalf. So that, to some extent, can help to explain why capital structure under this case doesn't matter, right? Because the shareholders don't need the firm to take on debt for them. They can just take on debt on their own. So why bother to let the firm do that? They can just keep the same capital structure. And so in that sense, it doesn't matter for the shareholders. So to explain that, we can use this so-called homemade leverage. So that's called homemade leverage as the shareholders borrow or lending on their own. So that's the so-called homemade leverage. So let's assume that this is for the unlevered case. We already calculated the earnings per share under each of the three economy states as we did here. So this is just copied from the numbers we did here. And Let's just say that the shareholder wants to buy 40 shares of this common stock, and we said the stock is priced at $50 per share. So that's $40 per share is 40 shares for the $50 per share is gonna be 40 times 50. That's $2,000 in total, right? But here, the shareholders don't want a firm to borrow on their behalf. They actually decided to borrow on their own using the margin account. So to keep the same debt ratio as the firm, so if we go back to the firm, we see that the debt ratio of the firm is here. It's 2/3. Yeah, so it's B. Here's B over S or D over E. That's 2/3. So we want to keep the same debt ratio. So that's why the shareholder wants to borrow $800 out of this $2,000 because that can keep the debt ratio to be 800. Let's say it's 800 divided by 2,000, right? So, uh, oh, that's the debt ratio, but what we want to compare is the debt equity ratio. So that's gonna be 8,800 divided by 2,000 minus 800. So that's why this is the same. Yeah, this is the same as this D over E ratio we just looked at here. So by borrowing $800, the shareholder can keep the same personal leverage ratio as the firm. So now let's calculate its ROE, which means it's net profit divided by equity. So the shareholder uses $1,200 as the equity. That's the money of his own, and borrows $800 from the margin account to the total amount is $2,000 to buy 40 shares of $50 per share stock. So earnings per share here is earnings for 40 shares will be simply this earnings per share times the number of shares. So we do this the same for the other economy states. So this is the earnings for uh, these 40 shares. But remember, all of this, this is actually the cat. We can see this is a cash flow. It's better to be called cash flow, I think. Cash flows for 40 shares. But remember, the investor out of these 40 shares, $50 stock, $800 is borrowed. So by borrowing, the shareholder needs to pay interest. So that interest payment is simply equal to um, hmm. So every under every economy state, the interest payment will be 800 times the interest rate. So interest rate we still keep the same as under the firm case. The interest rate is 8%. Um, and then this will be the same. This will be the same throughout because this doesn't depend on economy state. So net profit will be the difference between the cash flow and this interest payment. So that's the net profit, and just extend this. So now the final part is the ROE, because that's where we can compare the ROE, return on equity for this shareholder versus the return on equity for the firm. We calculated in class. That's the ROE under the with the debt. So, and this is the net profit divided by the equity is simply the amount of money of the investor, that's 1200. So just pull this and you can see, just change the format to percentage. And now you can see this is exactly the same. So let me mark this in red to make it more transparent. So the ROE here is also, you can see if you compare these two groups of numbers, they are exactly the same. So that also means by using the so-called homemade leverage, the shareholders do not need the firm to borrow on their behalf. They can just borrow on their own using the margin account and get the same return out of their investment. So that's why the firm can still keep at the unlevered status, and so the shareholders do not care about the capital structure of the firm. So that also means the capital structure of the firm, in this case, without taxes, will be indifferent. The firm will be indifferent for the capital structure of the firm. So that's how we can use this homemade leverage to show that. And so we have the homemade leverage. We can also have the so-called homemade unleverage. So that's the last part of this slides. So that's when, well, the firm is already levered, but now the investor wants to invest in this levered firm. So by investing in a levered firm, you also sort of become levered. But now the investor wants to get back to the unlevered case. So by investing in this levered firm, he automatically becomes levered. So how could he become unlevered? He has to do something which is reverse what he did, what the firm does, which is the firm borrows. So if the investor wants to reverse the borrowing, he has to lend. So then that's why here they can buy, the investor buy a certain number of shares. Here 24 is trying to keep the same leverage ratio when he buys some of the debt of the firm. So he buys 24 shares of an otherwise identical levered firm along with some of the firm's debt. Because when he buys some of the firm's debt, that means he becomes the creditor of the firm. So he becomes a lender rather than borrower. So he reverses what the firm has done. So in that regard, he's getting back to the original unlevered case. And especially this 24 shares will give him 24 times 50, which is $1,200. So his share earnings for that will be $1,200, and he also uses $800 of the money to lend to the firm. So by that, he can get back to unlevered. And you can sort of do that calculation on your own and figure out ultimately the ROE here actually is the same. The ROE is the personal ROE, return on equity, is the same as the ROE of this unlevered firm. Yeah. So that's how we can use this to show that